Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Make America Civil Again. I always say like, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. So this week we are going to be chatting with Ian. Ian is a immigrant from the UK. He moved over here to the States about 6 years ago, and he is going to be sharing with us his thoughts on Trump, his thoughts on some of the DNC candidates, and socialism. So be sure to check him out and tell me what you think. He is a political commentator. He has his own YouTube channel. So I'll leave a description in the description below. I'll leave his information there so you can find him and hopefully subscribe and check him out. Also, he is on Instagram. So definitely go check out his Instagram as well. But here's Ian and I. First off, I want to say thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure's all mine. I think what you're doing is really great. Trying to get people to have political discussions without tearing each other's heads off is always a good thing.
Yeah, and shockingly, that seems to be harder and harder to do these days.
Yep.
A lot of people they don't want the civil conversation, but I like I've watched a few of your YouTube videos. I'm like, man, you've really got it down. You're good.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So how long have you been living here in the States?
So I moved to the States in the fall of 2013. So it's quite a while now. I feel like I'm vaguely settled in. I know where I'm going. I'm on the right side of the road most of the time. So that's got me out of most of the trouble I get into.
You came over in 2013, you said?
Yep. Yeah, so it's going to be 6 years in the fall, in September.
Okay. And what made you come, specifically to the United States? Why not any other country?
So I kind of always had living and working in the US as kind of one of the things I wanted to do. I didn't really have a set timeline on it. But a year after graduation from college, I got the opportunity to come out and work at a small software company. So just kind of jumped at the chance. It happened a lot faster than I meant to, and came here and I really loved it and ended up staying. So yeah, it kind of really just one thing happened after another. It was never like a big set plan.
Oh, so you're a conservative.
Yeah.
So coming from the UK, being conservative, what from what I hear, that seems to be pretty rare. Am I wrong? So
there's a lot of conservatives in the UK, but there's quite a distinct difference between American conservative and British conservative.
Okay.
There's some similarities, but I feel I fit a lot more with the American conservative mold than the British conservative. So British conservatives, they kind of still tend to believe in kind of big government. They're still kind of behind a lot of the more, I wouldn't say left wing, but left leaning policies. Just they don't have as extreme solutions to them. So for me, I always felt like that really wasn't what I believed in. I believed much more in kind of much more smaller controlled government, kind of regional power, that kind of thing. So coming here and discovering American conservatism was a much better fit for me. And obviously something I knew about it, but never experienced until you live here. So that was a really great feeling, because I always felt a little out of the water, even sort of amongst conservatives in the UK, because you really have kind of mainstream conservatives, which are, I would say, similar to the Democrats. This is very kind of ballpark figure, but very similar to the Democrats before they became so radical. And that doesn't really fit with me. And then if you go further right wing in England, that tends to take you into some more kind of dangerous waters. You tend to be with some more kind of extremist groups, whereas American conservatism in the mainstream is not down that extremist route.
Yeah.
So that's nice. Well, I think a lot of it is also, it comes down to something the left do. I'd say the radical left do quite a lot, is kind of a war of language where they mischaracterize anyone who is not them in a negative light. So conservatism by definition is not radical. There are people who claim to be conservative that may be radical. Mm-hmm. But if you look at the very kind of underlying fundamentals of conservatism, individual freedom, all of these kind of things, it's very hard to be radical in that context. Yeah. I think the problem right now is you've got a lot of people who claim to be conservative who very much are not. So you look at some people in the alt-right, for example, they claim to be conservative, but thoroughly rejected by the majority of kind of real conservatives. So
yes,
I think that's often taken advantage of.
Yeah, and it's and they attack conservatives who claim to be conservative for not being their kind of conservative.
Yeah.
Which really isn't conservative.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
you
like,
know, like
you're
you
an
said,
individual, but not the right kind of individual for me. Get out of here.
Yeah. Exactly. Like, what made you want to start becoming like a conservative, or at least a political commentator?
Yeah. So it's kind of something I never really thought about until I'd say a year or two ago. So living in the Bay Area, things got pretty extreme. I'd say the moment Trump got in, all hell broke loose. I think that's kind of a universal problem, but it's definitely turned up to 11 here. Yeah. I saw a lot of people who, on the one hand, claim to be all about equality and all about tolerance, saying the most absurd things, not necessarily about Trump, but about every conservative. I've been in regular conversations where people have made just really quite appalling statements that if you flipped to, say, a conservative saying that about someone on the left, it would be just widely rejected.
Yes.
So I was seeing this all over the place, and I thought, well, I don't feel this way. I'm not happy with going along quietly with it, but I want to try and approach this and actually help fix it, even on a very small scale. Like my audience is very small right now. I hope it's going to grow, but any individual I can, reach in some way and have a conversation with is a positive. Not only to put forward a kind of what I hope is a level-headed and reasonable version of conservatism, but also just to make people more comfortable with actually discussing topics that are often taboo. Like the most things that weren't ridiculous to talk about 5-10 years ago are now almost untouchable. So talking about some things like sexism, racism, abortion, these kind of topics are almost like, in England, they're called hot potato topics. I don't know if we have that phrase here, but no one wants to touch it. Yeah. You're labeled as something before you even begin. So I think that's what really drove me to do it. I started writing. I was fortunate enough to have some of that picked up by the Daily Wire, so I get some of my articles in there. I've written a couple of things for the Federalist, and it kind of took off from there a little bit.
Okay.
And then in terms of my podcast, I started that a month or two ago. So that's kind of still in the very baby step stages, still kind of learning how to do it, getting used to talking to a camera and no one looking back at me and all kinds of crazy things. It's very insular. It's like bordering on narcissistic sometimes, but trying to stay away from that.
And it's like, what are your thoughts like on American politics, namely all this like banter about Donald Trump? Like, what's your take on it? Especially being an immigrant, I think that would.
Yeah. So I think it's. If I had to have one word, I'd say it's very overblown. But I think there's a lot of complexities to it that people aren't being honest with. So I think on the left, people are demonizing Trump in some ways correctly. I think there's a lot of things he's done and said that I don't agree with. To some extent, some things he's said and done are quite appalling. But the problem is that every single criticism, the dial is turned up to 11. So there's really no kind of consistent metric for whether what he's done is actually deserving of criticism or actually deserving of praise. Yes. So it kind of gets to the point where it's just this endless noise, where people are just banging the Trump drum, where he is the scapegoat for all our problems. Once he's gone, the orange man is gone, everything will be good again.
Yeah.
And so I think you've got that kind of intellectual dishonesty on the left. And I think also to some extent within conservatism, I think the craziness surrounding Trump, it's almost flipped, where people have reacted to the almost idol worship of Obama by just finding their own idol to worship with Trump. I think there's a lot of people who like Trump can do no wrong. He's the best thing ever, which again is not intellectually honest. I think he's done quite a lot of great things as a president. I think he's done quite a lot of bad things, or at least said more bad things than he's done, which is a good thing. So I think just the lack of honesty from both sides is very shocking to me coming in, where people are so inconsistent when it comes to their own views, their own standards. I think as an immigrant, it's kind of interesting. I think there's a very stereotypical image of an immigrant, which is often more kind of for political expediency, where they like to paint immigrants as victims. There's a lot of conflation between legal and illegal immigration, again, for political gain. So often I'm not even viewed as an immigrant in conversations. People will be talking to people like, oh, well, you hate immigrants. It's like just another self-hating Jewish guy, I guess. But it's very strange. I think I don't fit into a lot of these models, so people are quite surprised. But yeah, in answer to your question, I'm sorry to ramble a little bit, but it's definitely surprising. I think much more polarized than the UK in a lot of ways. I think the UK will catch up in a few years, but America is definitely number one when it comes to polarization of politics.
Yeah.
I think something else that's interesting, just the difference between the US and the UK. I think the issues are much more polarizing too. So I think in the UK, for example, most people are behind the idea that there should be some form of national health service, which is the kind of vaguely socialized medicine, accessible medicine for all, that kind of thing. But in the US, that is a full-on debate whether or not that should be a thing. Looking at gun control, for example, like the Second Amendment exists here. I'm very, very supportive of that, very grateful for that. But in the UK, that's not a thing. And so that's not even a debate that exists.
Yeah.
But and abortion is another one. So you've got a lot of these debates which are very much yes or no. You can't really have a middle ground on abortion, for example. Intellectually, you cannot have a middle ground. Same really with gun control to some extent, and all of these issues. So I think you've got a very polarized political system. You have very polarized policies within that system. It's very much built to have this split where you're almost rewarded by becoming more extreme on either side, because that's where your guaranteed kind of base is, I guess. It's very interesting to kind of watch when I was more of an outsider and kind of just learning about it. Just the aggression as well was quite shocking. I think the aggressive language, but it's also that there's no real the reward is not in the truth. The reward is in the attention. And so really there's no incentive to tell the truth because you've got broad support from their readers or their viewers or whatever it is, that you get the attention. And then if you retract it in page something quite large the next day, it doesn't really matter because our attention span is so short. We're on to the next thing anyway. It really doesn't matter.
Who do you think is going to be chosen for the candidacy? Like, who are you most concerned about? Like, who do you think? Like, let me ask that. Who do you think is going to go against Trump?
So I think Biden should win, unless the thing is he's very gaffe heavy. So if what he's doing right now is the smart move, which is just staying away and riding his 30+% to the polls.
Yeah.
If he can keep his mouth shut and not do anything stupid, I think he'll be the nominee. I think he has a pretty good chance. If I was betting on it, I would bet on him beating Trump. Honestly, I don't think there is enough negatives against Biden to pit against Trump. I think Trump is so broadly hated that if Biden can take a bite out of, say, some of the blue collar voters or some of these kind of Midwestern states, for example, it really doesn't need to take that much away from Trump to win.
Yeah.
In answer to your other question of who am I most worried about, I'm most worried about Bernie Sanders. I think he would be the worst first step, I think, in the wrong direction. I don't think as president he would have the powers to create a kind of socialist apocalyptic situation overnight. I think that's yet another good system of the American political design where you can't just ruin things overnight.
Yeah.
But I think he would spark a very dangerous change where over the next generation you kind of walked through that socialist door, and Europe has shown us this in the UK. Once you go through that door, you never come back. You never repeal these things. Once you give people more free stuff, they don't want to give those things up. Yeah. So I think that would be terrifying.
Yeah.
What's kind of funny is I think people don't realize quite how high up there in terms of average quality of life America has over a lot of other countries. I think often America it's a double-edged sword where it's a bubble, so you have a lot of positives, but you also don't realize how good things are in America compared to other places. Of course, America has a lot of problems, but you look at some of these countries that are really on the constant brink of bankruptcy effectively because they're sort of really pummeling money into these systems. It's just unsustainable, especially when you take things like immigration into account, where you have huge amounts of immigration over a set number of years, where you have giant influxes of people in various areas that all require welfare, that kind of thing. But again, that's a dangerous topic to broach because you often get that rejected as, talking about immigration, that's an element of racism. You can't go there. So I think there's...
I'm shocked you mentioned Bernie.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I haven't been paying attention to the polls lately, but like my biggest concern right now is Pete Buttigieg. Like, what are your thoughts on?
So I believe currently in the polls he's got about 6%. So if he climbs a bit more, I'll be more worried. But I'm basically most worried about Bernie because he's, I'm not sure of the exact numbers, but he's a not particularly close second to Biden.
Yeah.
I mean, we can always rely on the DNC being nicely corrupt. So given that they kind of screwed Bernie over a little bit in 2016, I would be willing to bet they would screw him over again. But they're also riding a far more radical left wave right now. So he might be the sort of good pick for them. But some of his policies, it's kind of unbelievable. Just hearing him speak about it, it's just like the demonization of the wealthy, which he is now a member of the 1%, which he keeps nicely quiet. I think he would be an absolutely appalling president and a real disaster, not only domestically but foreign policy wise. I mean, this is someone who praised communist Soviet Union and all kinds of things, praised Fidel Castro, and it's just said bread lines are a good thing because people are getting bread. It's like, okay, that's a very low bar. So it would be a disaster, absolute disaster.
Yeah.
The ultimate fraud of socialism is that it's generational. And so they always prey on the younger generations because they're the first to hear it. And so that's why he's always going very, very hard after the teenage vote, trying to get people as young as possible to vote, getting people, millennials to vote, people who may not even have a real job yet to vote, because they are quite often the people who have not seen previous generations and the suffering that comes from kind of socialist systems. That's why they're trying to downplay Venezuela as much as possible, because that is a quite nearby, very gleaming example of how bad things can go under that system.
Yeah.
So that's why they always prey on the younger generation. But the problem is that there's always a new young generation who have come out and not really learned about the downsides of more left-leaning policies, quite often because education is very left-leaning as a general rule.
Yeah.
And so it's this constant cycle. So really fighting against socialism, it's like this never-ending game of whack-a-mole. You just got to keep smashing away. You can't let up. People aren't going to learn one day that individual freedom matters more than kind of group freedom and those kind of things.
Yeah.
I would point to other countries. I think like Venezuela is always the example we should use, because that's literally the end point. If you look at every country that has fully embraced any form of socialism, you never stop, because it's always the next thing, because it never gets you where you want to go. You have to take more money, you have to take more control, more power. It's a really dangerous, slippery slope but people are enticed by free stuff. I mean, who doesn't love free stuff?
Yeah.
Well, I think the big problem with the handouts is that it completely changes the culture of whatever community is receiving those handouts, because you've got no incentive to really pursue anything, because at least for the short term, if you say like the first generation who starts right at the bottom, say if you're an immigrant, you're starting right at the bottom, the amount you would get on welfare is always going to be better than the amount you would get having to really work your way up. Generationally, it might not be the same, but people often think in the short term. I think something I'm worried about on a very kind of high level is the desire for government to be the thing that solves your problems. You hear this all the time. Whenever people are talking about any issue, whether it be very, very low level, very high level, it's what's the government going to do about it? And it's that mentality which is the problem of communities need to be solving the problems they can solve. I'm not going to say that communities can solve everything.
Yeah.
But there's, for example, space for charity in communities that doesn't need to be filled by federal government, and all these kind of levels where I think, especially when we take religion out of a lot of these communities, there is a vast void that is being filled by government, and the government wants to expand forever. It's not going to stay where it is.
No.
So I think, say, the lack of religion in a lot of these communities just fuels that even further, because you lose a lot of these values, and then it's all about yourself, of what can the government do for me, which is pretty much the opposite of everything, I believe. So that's quite hard to deal with sometimes.
Yeah. But Ian, thank you so much for coming on here, and just
all right. Great to meet you.
Hey, nice to meet you, and we'll be talking soon.
Have a good one. Bye.
You too. Bye. All right, everybody. I hope you guys enjoyed that conversation. I thought Ian was a very insightful individual. I thought he made some very solid points, and you will be seeing him again. So don't forget to go check out some of Ian's stuff that he has on YouTube, but also on Instagram. But until next Wednesday, I'm out. Later.